Today we'll be reading some more actual history from the following book, Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This book was published all the way back in 1871. So in the last episode in this series, Fanny Kelly was taken to the Sioux village, where she was a guest at the dog feast. In this episode, Fanny will be taken on the warpath with the Sioux, as General Sully's army pursues them. But before I read from Fanny's account, I'm going to read from Reverend Pfaller's book, which is titled Sully's Expedition of 1864. This is a book that I couldn't find in print, but there is a PDF that I will post a link to in the description section of this video. The part of this book I'm going to read describes events that took place on June 28, 1864. These events likely motivated the attack on Fanny Kelly's wagon train, which took place exactly 2 weeks later, on Tuesday, July 12, 1864. June 28, 1864 had begun as just another uneventful marching day for General Alfred Sully's army in Dakota Territory, but it did not end that way. The northbound column was paralleling the east bank of the Missouri in what is now Potter County, South Dakota. Captain John Pfaller, topographical engineer for the expedition, was enjoying himself collecting specimens at some distance from the main column. Though General Sully had often warned him to take along a larger escort on his scientific wanderings, the captain laughingly replied that he did not believe there were any Indians in the country. This day he took 2 soldiers and rode to a curious medicine rock, in which were embedded 3 human footprints. Near the mouth of the Little Cheyenne, the trio picketed their horses and walked toward the creek for a drink of water. As they neared a clump of bushes, a shot rang out in the hot summer air. Captain Pfaller slumped forward, mortally wounded by a shot through the lungs. 3 Sioux Indians sprang from the bushes and made a dash for their horses, but the snorting steeds reared, pulled out their picket pins, and ran away. The Indians quickly took for the hills on foot. When news of the tragedy reached the column, General Sully ordered Captain Nelson Milner to take his Dakota cavalry, called the Coyotes, and pursue the fleeing Indians. For at least 8 miles, a dozen cavalrymen galloped in hot pursuit, shouting their battle cry, "Death to the murderers!" They finally surrounded the refugees in a buffalo wallow, and then blazed more than 200 shots at the Indians, until the last one fell, riddled with bullets. The Dakota boys returned in triumph with the Indians' guns, bows, and arrows. General Sully beamed with satisfaction, but he wanted more. He wanted the heads of the Indians. Back to the scene went a detail of soldiers. Sergeant Benjamin Estes cut off the heads with a butcher knife and thrust them into a gunny sack. The next morning, Sully gave orders that the ghastly trophies be impaled on poles on the highest hill near the camp, as a warning to all Indians that he meant business. The bloody events had far-reaching and sobering effects on both Indians and white men. On every soldier's face appeared a sort of grim determination and earnestness, and every man in the brigade seemed to tighten his belt. Among the Indians, the effect was electrifying. The story of the beheading of the warriors at the Little Cheyenne flew as upon the wings of the wind to every Sioux camp from the Oglalas on the Platte to the bands in farthest Canada. The Sioux read in it the determination of the whites to exterminate their nation, and they concluded that their only safety lay in flight to those places which were considered inaccessible to the soldiers. So now we'll pick up with Fanny Kelly in late July of 1864, as she is a captive with the Sioux. The next morning the whole village was in motion. The warriors were going to battle against a white enemy, they said, and old men, women, and children were sent out in another direction to a place of safety, as designated by the chief. Everything was soon moving. With the rapidity of custom, the tent poles were lowered and the tents rolled up. The cooking utensils were put together and laid on crossbeams connecting the lower ends of the poles as they trail the ground from the horses' sides, to which they are attached. Dogs, too, were made useful in this exodus, and started off with smaller burdens dragging after them, in the same manner that horses are packed. The whole village was in commotion, children screaming or laughing, dogs barking or growling under their heavy burdens, squaws running hither and thither pulling down teepee poles, packing up everything, and leading horses and dogs with huge burdens. The small children are placed in sacks of buffalo skin and hung upon saddles, or their mothers' backs. The wrapped-up lodges, which are secured by thongs, are fastened to the poles on the horses' backs, together with sundry other articles of domestic use, and upon these are seated women and children. To guide the horse, a woman goes before, holding the bridle, carrying on her back a load nearly as large as the horse carries. Women and children are sometimes mounted upon horses, holding in their arms every variety of plunder. Sometimes they hold little dogs and other forlorn and hungry-looking pets. In this unsightly manner, sometimes 2,000 or 3,000 families are transported many miles at the same migration, and, all being in motion at the same time, the cavalcade extends for a great distance. The men and boys are not so unsightly in their appearance, being mounted upon good horses and the best Indian ponies, riding in groups, leaving the women and children to trudge along with the burdened horses and dogs. The number and utility of these faithful dogs is sometimes astonishing, as they count hundreds, each bearing a portion of the general household goods. 2 poles about 10 or 12 feet long are attached to the shoulders of a clog, leaving one end of each dragging upon the ground. On these poles a small burden is carried, and with it the faithful canine jogs along, looking neither to the right nor to the left, but apparently intent upon reaching the end of his journey. These faithful creatures are under the charge of women and children, and their pace is occasionally encouraged with admonitions in the form of vigorous and zealous use of whips, applied to their limbs and sides. It was quite painful to me to see these poor animals thus taken from their natural avocation, and forced to a slavish life of labor, and compelled to travel along with their burdens. Yet when this change has been made, they become worthless as hunters or watchers, and even for the purpose of barking, being reduced instead to beasts of burden. It was not uncommon to see a great wolfish-looking dog moodily jogging along with a lot of cooking utensils on one side, and on the other a crying papoose for a balance, while his sulking companion toils on, supporting on his back a quarter of antelope or elk, and is followed by an old woman or some children, who keep at bay all refractory dogs who run loose, occasionally showing their superiority by snapping and snarling at their more unfortunate companions. This train was immensely large, nearly the whole Sioux nation having concentrated there for the purpose of war. We toiled on all day. Late in the afternoon we arrived at the ground of encampment, and rested for further orders from the warriors who had gone to battle and would join us there. I had no means of informing myself at that time with whom the war was raging, but afterward I learned that General Sully's army was pursuing the Sioux, and that the engagement was with his men. In 3 days the Indians returned to camp, and entered on a course of feasting and rejoicing that caused me to believe that they had suffered very little loss in the affray. They passed their day of rest in this sort of entertainment, and here I first saw the scalp dance, which ceremonial did not increase my respect or confidence in the tender mercies of my captors. This performance is only gone through at night, and by the light of torches. Consequently, its terrible characteristics are heightened by the fantastic gleams of the lighted brands. The women, too, took part in the dance, and I was forced to mingle in the fearful festivity, painted and dressed for the occasion, and holding a staff from the top of which hung several scalps. The braves came vauntingly forth with the most extravagant boasts of their wonderful prowess and courage in war, and at the same time brandishing weapons in their hands with the most fearful contortions and threatenings. A number of young women came with them, carrying the trophies of their friends which they hold aloft, while the warriors jump around in a circle, brandishing their weapons and whooping and yelling the fearful war cry in a most frightful manner, all jumping upon both feet at the same time, with simultaneous stamping and motions with their weapons, keeping exact time. Their gestures impressed one as if they were actually cutting and carving each other to pieces as they utter their fearful, sharp yell. They become furious as they grow more excited until their faces are distorted to the utmost. Their glancing eyes protrude with a fiendish, indescribable appearance, while they grind their teeth and try to imitate the hissing, gurgling sound of death in battle. Furious and faster grows the stamping, until the sight is more like a picture of fiends in a carnival of battle than anything else to which the war dance can be compared. No description can fully convey the terrible sight in all its fearful barbarity, as the bloody trophies of their victory are brandished aloft in the light of the flickering blaze, and their distorted forms are half concealed by darkness. The object for which the scalp is taken is exultation and proof of valor and success. My pen is powerless to portray my feelings during this terrible scene. The country we were in seemed scarred by countless trails, where the Indian ponies had dragged lodge poles in their change of habitations or hunting. The antipathy of the Indian to its occupation or invasion by the white man is very intense and bitter. The felling of timber or killing of buffalo or the traveling of a train or any signs of permanent possession by the white man excites deadly hostility. It is their last hope. If they yield and give up this, they will have to die or ever after be governed by the white man's laws. Consequently, they lose no opportunity to kill or steal from and harass the whites when they can do so. The game still clings to its favorite haunts, and the Indian must press upon the steps of the white man or lose all hope of independence. Herds of elk proudly stand with erect antlers, as if charmed by music, or as if curious to understand this strange inroad upon their long-secluded parks of pleasure. The mountain sheep look down from belting crags that skirt the perpendicular northern face of the mountains, and yield no rival of their charms or excellence for food. The black and white-tailed deer and antelope are ever present, while the hare and the rabbit, the sage hen and the prairie chicken are nearly trodden down before they yield to the intrusion of the stranger. Brants, wild geese, and ducks multiply and people the waters of the beautiful lakes, and are found in many of the streams. The grizzly and cinnamon bears are often killed, and give up their rich material for the hunter's profit. And the buffalo, in numberless herds with tens of thousands in a herd, sweep back and forth, filling the valley as far as the eye can reach, and adding their value to the Indian both for food, habitation, fuel, and clothing. The Bighorn River and mountains and streams beyond are plentifully supplied with various kinds of fish. The country seems to be filled with wolves, which pierce the night air with their howls. But like the beavers whose dams encumber all the smaller streams, and the otter, they are forced to yield their nice coats for the Indian, as well as the white man's luxury. The Indians felt that the proximity of the troops and their inroads through their best hunting grounds would prove disastrous to them and their future hopes of prosperity, and soon again they were making preparations for battle, and again on the 8th of August the warriors set forth on the warpath, and this time the action seemed to draw ominously near our encampment. An Indian boy died the night before, and was buried rather hastily in the morning. The body was wrapped in some window curtains that once draped my windows at Geneva. There was also a red blanket and many beads and trinkets deposited on an elevated platform with the moldering remains, and the bereaved mother and relatives left the lonely spot with loud lamentations. There seemed to be great commotion and great anxiety in the movements of the Indians, and presently I could hear the sound of battle, and the echoes that came back to me from the reports of the guns in the distant hills warned me of the near approach of my own people, and my heart became a prey to wildly conflicting emotions as they hurried on in great desperation, and even forbid me turning my head and looking in the direction of the battle. Once I broke the rule and was severely punished for it. They kept their eyes upon me and were very cross and unkind. Panting for rescue, yet fearing for its accomplishment, I passed the day. The smoke of action now rose over the hills beyond. The Indians now realized their danger and hurried on in great consternation. General Sully's soldiers appeared in close proximity, and I could see them charging on the Indians, who, according to their habits of warfare, skulked behind trees, sending their bullets and arrows vigorously forward into the enemy's ranks. I was kept in advance of the moving column of women and children, who were hurrying on, crying and famishing for water, trying to keep out of the line of firing. It was late at night before we stopped our pace, when at length we reached the lofty banks of a noble river, but it was some time before they could find a break in the rocky shores, which enabled us to reach the water and enjoy the delicious draught, in which luxury the panting horses gladly participated. We had traveled far and fast all day long without cessation, through clouds of smoke and dust parched by a scorching sun. My face was blistered from the burning rays, as I had been compelled to go with my head uncovered, after the fashion of all Indian women. Until now I had not had a drop of water during the whole day. Reluctant to leave the long-desired acquisition, they all lay down under the tall willows close to the stream, and slept the sleep of the weary. The horses lingered near, nipping the tender blades of grass that sparsely bordered the stream. It was not until next morning that I thought of how they should cross the river, which I supposed to have been the Missouri. It was not very wide, but confined between steep banks. It seemed to be deep and quite rapid. They did not risk swimming at that place, to my joy, but went further down, and all plunged in and swam across, leading my horse. I was very much frightened, and cried to heaven for mercy. On that morning we entered a gorge, a perfect mass of huge fragments which had fallen from the mountains above. They led my horse and followed each other closely, and with as much speed as possible, as we were still pursued by the troops. During the day, some 2 or 3 warriors were brought in wounded. I was called to see them and assist in dressing their wounds. This being my first experience of the kind, I was at some loss to know what was best to do. But, seeing in it a good opportunity to raise in their estimation, I endeavored to impress them with an air of my superior knowledge of surgery, and as nurse or medicine woman. I felt now from their motions and meaning glances that my life was not safe, since we were so closely pursued over this terrible barren country. My feelings all this time cannot be described. When I could hear the sound of the big guns, as the Indians term cannon, I felt that the soldiers had surely come for me, and would overtake us, and my heart bounded with joy at the very thought of deliverance, but sunk proportionately when the Indians came to me, bearing their trophies, reeking scalps, soldiers' uniforms covered with blood, which told its sad story to my aching heart. One day I might be cheered by strong hope of approaching relief, but then again would have such assurance of my enemy's success as would sink me correspondingly low in despair. For some reason, deception seemed to be their peculiar delight. Whether they did it to gratify an insatiable thirst for revenge in themselves, or to keep me more reconciled, more willing and patient to abide, was something I could not determine. The feelings occasioned by my disappointment in their success can better be imagined than described, but imagination, even in her most extravagant flights, can but poorly picture the horrors that met my view during these running flights. My constant experience was hope deferred that maketh the heart sick. It was most tantalizing and painful to my spirit to be so near our forces and the flag of liberty, and yet a prisoner and helpless. On and still on we were forced to fly, to a place known among them as the Bad Lands, a section of country so wildly desolate and barren as to induce the belief that its present appearance is the effect of volcanic action. Great boulders of blasted rock are piled scattering around, and hard, dry sand interspersed among the crevices. Everything in this region has a ruined look, as if vegetation and life had formerly existed there, but had been suddenly interrupted by some violent commotion of nature. A terrible blight, like the fulfillment of an ancient curse, darkens the surface of the gloomy landscape. And the desolate, ruinous scene might well represent the entrance to the infernal shades described by classic writers. A choking wind with sand blows continually and fills the air with dry and blinding dust. The water is sluggish and dark and apparently life-destroying in its action, since all that lies around its moistened limits has assumed the form of petrifaction. Rocks though they now seemed, they had formerly held life, both animal and vegetable, and their change will furnish a subject of interesting speculation to enterprising men of science, who penetrate those mournful shades to discover toads, snakes, birds, and a variety of insects, together with plants, trees, and many curiosities, all petrified and having the appearance of stone. I was startled by the strange and wonderful sights. The terrible scarcity of water and grass urged us forward, and General Sully's army in the rear gave us no rest. The following day or two we were driven so far northward and became so eminently imperiled by the pursuing forces that they were obliged to leave all their earthly effects behind them and swim the Yellowstone River for life. By this time the ponies were completely famished for want of food and water, so jaded that it was with great difficulty and hard blows that we could urge them on at all. When Indians are pursued closely, they evince a desperate and reckless desire to save themselves, without regard to property or provisions. They throw away everything that will impede flight, and all natural instinct seems lost in fear. We had left in our compulsory haste immense quantities of plunder, even lodges standing, which proved of immediate help, but in the end a terrible loss. General Sully with his whole troop stopped to destroy the property, thus giving us an opportunity to escape, which saved us from falling into his hands as otherwise we inevitably would have done. A whole day was consumed in collecting and burning the Indian lodges, blankets, provisions, etc., and that day was used advantageously in getting beyond his reach. They travel constantly in time of war, ranging over vast tracts of country, and prosecuting their battles or skirmishes with a quiet determination unknown to the whites. A few days' pursuit after Indians is generally enough to wear and tire out the ardor of the white man, as it is almost impossible to pursue them through their own country with wagons and supplies for the army, and it is very difficult for American horses to traverse the barren, rugged mountain passes, the Indians having every advantage in their own country, and using their own mode of warfare. The weary soldiers return disheartened by often losing their dear comrades, and leaving them in a lonely grave on the plain, dissatisfied with only scattering their Indian foes. But the weary Indians rest during these intervals, often sending the friendly Indians, as they are called and believed to be, who are received in that character in the forts, and change it for a hostile one as soon as they reach the hills, to get supplies of ammunition and food, with which they refresh themselves and prosecute the war. After the attack of General Sully was over, an Indian came to me with a letter to read, which he had taken from a soldier who was killed by him, and the letter had been found in his pocket. The letter stated that the topographical engineer was killed, and that General Sully's men had caught the Indians, and cut their heads off, and stuck them up on poles. The soldier had written a friendly and kind letter to his people, but ere it was mailed, he was numbered with the dead. As soon as we were safe and General Sully pursued us no longer, the warriors returned home, and a scene of terrible mourning over the killed ensued among the women. Their cries are terribly wild and distressing on such occasions, and the near relations of the deceased indulge in frantic expressions of grief that cannot be described. Sometimes the practice of cutting the flesh is carried to a horrible and barbarous extent. They inflict gashes on their bodies and limbs an inch in length. Some cut off their hair, blacken their faces, and march through the village in procession, torturing their bodies to add vigor to their lamentations. Hunger followed on the track of grief. All their food was gone, and there was no game in that portion of the country. In our flight they had scattered everything, and the country through which we passed for the following 2 weeks did not yield enough to arrest starvation. The Indians were terribly enraged, and threatened me with death almost hourly, and in every form. I had so hoped for liberty when my friends were near, but alas, all my fond hopes were blasted. The Indians told me that the army was going in another direction. They seemed to have sustained a greater loss than I had been made aware of, which made them feel very revengeful toward me. The next morning I could see that something unusual was about to happen. Notwithstanding the early hour, the sun scarcely appearing above the horizon, the principal chiefs and warriors were assembled in council, where, judging from the grave and reflective expression of their countenances, they were about to discuss some serious question. I had reason for apprehension from their unfriendly manner toward me, and feared for the penalty I might soon have to pay. Soon they sent an Indian to me who asked me if I was ready to die, to be burned at the stake. I told him whenever Wakan Tonka, the Great Spirit, was ready, he would call for me, and then I would be ready and willing to go. He said that he had been sent from the council to warn me that it had become necessary to put me to death, on account of my white brothers killing so many of their young men recently. He repeated that they were not cruel for the pleasure of being so, necessity is their first law, and he and the wise chiefs, faithful to their hatred for the white race, were in haste to satisfy their thirst for vengeance, and further that the interests of their nation required it. As soon as the chiefs were assembled around the council fire, the pipe carrier entered the circle, holding in his hand the pipe ready lighted. Bowing to the 4 cardinal points, he uttered a short prayer or invocation, and then presented the pipe to the old chief, Ottawa, but retained the bowl in his hand. When all the chiefs and men had smoked, one after the other, the pipe-bearer emptied the ashes into the fire, saying, "Chiefs of the great Dakota nation, Wakan Tonka give you wisdom, so that whatever be your determination it may be comfortable to justice." Then, after bowing respectfully, he retired. A moment of silence followed, in which everyone seemed to be meditating seriously upon the words that had just been spoken. At length one of the most aged of the chiefs, whose body was furrowed with the scars of innumerable wounds, and who enjoyed among his people a reputation for great wisdom, arose. Said he, "The palefaces, our eternal persecutors, pursue and harass us without intermission, forcing us to abandon to them one by one our best hunting grounds, and we are compelled to seek a refuge in the depths of these badlands, like timid deer. Many of them even dare to come into prairies which belong to us, to trap beaver, and hunt elk and buffalo which are our property. These faithless creatures, the outcasts of their own people, rob and kill us when they can. Is it just that we should suffer these wrongs without complaining? Shall we allow ourselves to be slaughtered like timid Assiniboines without seeking to avenge ourselves? Does not the law of the Dakotas say justice to our own nation, and death to all palefaces? Let my brothers say if that is just," pointing to the stake that was being prepared. "Vengeance is allowable," sententiously remarked Mapea, meaning the sky. Another old chief, Ottawa, arose and said, "It is the undoubted right of the weak and oppressed, and yet it ought to be proportioned to the injury received. Then why should we put this young, innocent woman to death? Has she not always been kind to us, smiled upon us, and sang for us? Do not all our children love her as a tender sister? Why then should we put her to so cruel a death for the crimes of others, if they are of her nation? Why should we punish the innocent for the guilty?" I look to heaven then for mercy and protection, offering up those earnest prayers that are never offered in vain, and oh, how thankful I was when I knew their decision was to spare my life. Though terrible were my surroundings, life always became sweet to me when I felt that I was about to part with it. A terrible time ensued, and many dogs and horses even died of starvation. Their bodies were eaten immediately, and the slow but constant march was daily kept up, in hope of game and better facilities for fish and fruit. Many days in succession I tasted no food save what I could gather on my way. A few rose leaves and blossoms was all I could find, except the grass I would gather and chew for nourishment. Fear, fatigue, and long-continued abstinence were wearing heavily on my already shattered frame. Women and children were crying for food. It was a painful sight to witness their sufferings with no means of alleviating them, and no hope of relief save by traveling and hunting. We had no shelter save the canopy of heaven, and no alternative but to travel on, and at night lie down on the cold, damp ground for a resting place. If I could but present to my readers a truthful picture of that Indian home at that time, with all its sorrowful accompaniments, they are certainly engraved upon my faithful memory to last forever, but no touch of pen could give any semblance of the realities to another. What exhibitions of their pride and passion I have seen! What ideas of their intelligence and humanity I have been compelled to form! What manifestations of their power and ability to govern had been thrust upon me! The treatment received was not such as to enhance in any wise a woman's admiration for the so-called noble Indian, but rather to make one pray to be delivered from their power. Compelled to travel many days in succession and to experience the gnawings of hunger without mitigation, every day had its share of toil and fear. Yet while my temporal wants were thus poorly supplied, I was not wholly denied spiritual food. It was a blessed consolation that no earthly foe could interrupt my communion with the heavenly world. In my midnight waking hours I was visited with many bright visions. He walks with thee, that angel kind, and gently whispers, be resigned. Bear up, bear on, the end shall tell. The dear Lord ordereth all things well. So in this episode, Fanny Kelly was once again almost put to death, this time to avenge the defeat that the Sioux suffered in battle against General Sully's troops. But Chief Ottawa spoke up in her defense, and her life was again spared. So to provide a little more of General Sully's perspective at this time, I'm going to read another section from the book by Reverend Pfaller. These were some of General Sully's views on the immigrants who were moving in. The general was greatly displeased by the presence of the immigrant train, with its slow-moving oxen and its need for an armed guard of 400 soldiers. He made no secret of his disdain for the immigrants, many of whom he considered cowardly draft dodgers. On July 17th, astride his fine dappled gray horse, Sully reviewed his troops. The next day, he and his officers rode over to the immigrant camp, and he addressed the civilians. Gentlemen, I am damn sorry you are here, but so long as you are, I will do my best I can to protect you. Tomorrow morning at 2 o'clock I will leave here, and for the first 2 days there will be no danger. Then I will issue an order, and though it may seem ridiculous to you, there will be a reason for it, and I don't want you to think it strange if I stop you for a day or two at a time, or make you march farther than you would like. I expect to jump an Indian camp and give them hell. I shall go to the Yellowstone River and there establish another fort. Then go on to the Powder River when I will leave you. Keep together, for in union there is strength. The fortune hunters thereupon vigorously swung their hats into the air and cheered loudly for Sully and for Colonel Thomas, who had led them from Minnesota. So General Sully really didn't seem to like these immigrant trains, even though he did his best to protect them. So this channel was named Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is deemed unworthy of history channels on TV, and because we are unworthy to stand in the shoes of some of the people we talk about on this channel. So in the next episode in this series, we'll hear about another female captive of the Sioux, who was taken from her Minnesota home in the outbreak of 1862. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.